And so we are at the end of chapter 4 of Exodus, and Moses is told to return to Egypt by Yahweh, and he is to perform all the wonders, so the magic tricks that Yahweh has given to Moses. But Yahweh says that I will harden his heart. And this is a theme throughout the Egypt story, the Exodus story, that, well, why doesn't the Pharaoh just let the Israelites go? And so the text answers that by saying, well, Yahweh hardens his heart. Well, why doesn't Yahweh lighten his heart? And the answer to that is that God wants to harden his heart so he'll show even more of his powers and bring glory to himself, Yahweh. Uh, this is really, I think, one of the most disappointing parts of this mythic story because by hardening his heart, this really plays against the critical idea of personal freedom, free will, the basic characteristic of human beings to make decisions and choices and then be held accountable and responsible for them, which, in my way of thinking, is absolutely essential and central to any philosophy of religion. So, let the chips fall where they may. This is really a terrible aspect of this story. And in verse 23, Yahweh has defined Israel as God's son. So Israel is like a son to Yahweh. And if Pharaoh doesn't let his son go, then Yahweh will kill his firstborn son. So this is Yahweh talking about killing a human being's firstborn son. Again, not a very enlightened part of the story. Verses 24, 25, and 26, we have this very interesting little story, this paragraph that probably was an independent paragraph or story floating around where the Lord sets out to kill Moses. And apparently because Moses has not circumcised one or both of his sons. But Zipporah, his wife, circumcises the son and puts the blood on Moses' feet, which could be a euphemism for his genitals. And then this explains why there is this phrase, bridegroom of blood by circumcision. So this may be a way of showing that circumcision is very important, that even someone like Moses could have extremely negative consequences from Yahweh for not obeying the law of circumcision. And it also explains why there may be this saying or practice of bridegroom circumcision, that is a young man being circumcised just before he is married or when he has reached adolescence. So nevertheless, very interesting to see God, Yahweh here, talking about killing Moses. The story of Exodus reads very easily. You'll be able to read it and you're probably familiar with it, so I'll go fairly fast. The word Hebrew is used a lot by Egyptians for the Israelites, and Hebrew is actually not really used that much in the Old Testament at all. I think it's only used about 34 times, and 20 of those are in Exodus. So Hebrew seems to be a word that outsiders use to describe Israel, whereas the Israelites do not use that word. And they don't even refer to their language as Hebrew, but something like Judean. In chapter 7, we have the magic tricks of the staffs turning into snakes, but the Egyptians also have magicians that do that. So I guess you could say in part that the book of Exodus is maybe trying to say that there's something more than just these magic tricks. It's going to get much deeper than that. That's only a prelude of the magic or miracle that's going to be happening later. As far as the historicity of Exodus, there's absolutely no historical validity to really any of this story in terms of there's no proof of Israel per se or Moses per se being in Egypt. The 10 plagues have some naturalistic explanations. For example, the water turning to blood. Actually, there is a red algae that often blooms on the Nile, and so that is probably a reference to that. If you take the Bible literally, you could say, does the whole Nile turn to blood? What kind of blood is it? Is it human blood or animal blood? Or is it just red in color because of the algae? And after the algae bloom, fish die, they're washed up on the shore, flies multiply, people get sick. So a lot of the plagues have a naturalistic explanation. One thing to note in chapter 8, Aaron stretches out his hand over the waters, and then the frogs come out. So it's not just Moses, it's also Aaron who is doing this. Also in chapter 8, part of the explanation for letting the people go is really not the freedom of the people. I mean, this is a story of an enslaved people finding freedom, but the way Yahweh couches it is, let my people go so that they may worship me. It seems like God is concerned with the people being able to aggrandize him, make him glorified and worship him. That seems to be his own selfish, self-centered reason. Or you could read it more generously as Yahweh is requesting their religious freedom. And the plagues go on. Pharaoh gives in, then his heart is hardened. Sometimes the text have him saying he hardens his own heart, so it's not just God's doing. In chapter 11, verse 2, the people are to ask for gold and silver so that Egypt will be plundered. There's no evidence of that, and it's sort of a very base motive, is that they're going to get gold and silver out of this, which again makes us think that the Bible is not necessarily the absolute Word of God in which every single sentence has absolute divine meaning written literally by God, but it's the struggle of peoples to come to an understanding of religion. It's various people's attempt to define society, to define God, to define who they are. So you're going to see that this is a very human book, I think. And here is one example that, it's about silver and gold. In chapter 11, verse 9, Yahweh says to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, in order that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So that's the explanation I was talking about earlier, that the reason God is stiffening or hardening or weighing down his heart is that his wonders can be seen all the more greatly. In chapter 12, we have the very important initiation of the Passover, which is a major Jewish tradition even in these days, and relates to the Christian ritual of the Eucharist or communion. What happens here is that they take some of the blood of the sacrificed animals and put it on their two doorposts, the two lintels, the sides of the doors, and God will pass over. Yahweh also says, on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. So this is actually from Yahweh's own mouth, that there are gods of Egypt, and God is judging them. This verse pretty clearly says they are real. And they are gods, and he's more powerful and will take judgment on them. So this is monolatry or henotheism, where there is one God who is the God of the particular culture. There are other gods. They are recognized as existing or potentially existing, but they are not to be worshipped or followed. You're not to have idols made to them. only one God that you worship, that you pray to, that you honor and glorify. But there are these other gods of other peoples. So this is henotheism, or the belief that there is one God for our culture, while other gods may exist and probably do exist in this view. It's pretty clear here that there are gods of Egypt, but they're going to be judged. In chapter 12, verse 41, it is said that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. And again, there's no historical evidence for that at all. We don't see a lot of cultural influence from that alleged 430 years. So this is probably, again, biblical exaggeration, hyperbole. The Hebrews are fleeing now in the desert. God actually says, go back, so to entice the Egyptians to follow them more. And Yahweh says in verse 4, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue the Hebrews that have come back, so that I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his army, and that the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. So again, this is the glory seeking that we talked about earlier. In chapter 15, we have the Song of Moses, and this is believed to be a very old part of the Hebrew scriptures because of the language. Especially, there's no use of the definite article the or ha in Hebrew. And we know that earlier Hebrew did not have that definite article. Interestingly, the story does not talk about the water being pushed up by two walls. It's more of just a flood. In chapter 15, verse 11, here again we have, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. So again, this reference to other gods, but our God, Yahweh, is more powerful. He's our God. He's our totem. He's our symbol of our society. He's our hero. He's our divine warrior. And that is called henotheism or monolatry. Monolatry, latros for worship, so worship of one. Henotheism, one God, but with the recognition that there may be other gods or are other gods. Chapter 16 talks about bread from heaven or manna, and that's where that idea comes from, this magical bread or substance that appears in the mornings. In chapter 17, we see the Hebrews fighting Amalek, and God fights with them, and God says, I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. So again, we have this warrior God who is fighting on the side of one group of people, instead of being more of a universal God related to all peoples. And we will see that's coming in the Hebrew scriptures, a more of a universal understanding of Elohim or Yahweh. But here we have a tribal God who is a warrior God of the people. And that's very similar to, for instance, some of the Greek gods. Athena was a warrior god for Athens. And this is a time over thousands of years where there are hundreds and hundreds of wars and battles, and the people are coming into conflict as they compete for resources in these small city-states, these small nations. So here we see Yahweh conceived of as a warrior god amongst other warrior gods. In 1811, Jethro is talking, and he says, now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods because he delivered the people from the Egyptians. Again, this idea of henotheism. And he also talks about fear of God. And most translations still use fear, going back to earlier English translations. But fear is not just the sense of being afraid. It's fear, but also great respect, a sense of awe, a sense of your smallness, a sense of your humanity, your frailty. So it could be like in deep respect, could be perhaps a better translation than fear.